field. We are so pleased that you could join us today. My name is Belle Jarneski, and I am the Executive Director of the Jewish Heritage Center of Western Canada. A reminder that this program is being recorded so that we can make it available on our YouTube channel. There will be an opportunity for questions and answers later on in the program. Please type your questions in at any point via the Q&A button, not the chat. The Jewish Heritage Center of Western Canada is located on ancestral lands on Treaty 1 territory. The Red River Valley is also the birthplace of the Métis. We recognize the historical fact emphasized by the Truth and Reconciliation Commission of Canada, the National Inquiry into Missing and Murdered Indigenous Women and Girls, and as acknowledged by the Government of Canada, that the Canadian government and various religious and secular organizations that predate the country perpetuated a genocide against the Indigenous peoples, and that elements of that genocide continue to the present day. We affirm that our commitment to never forget must also include confronting attempts to destroy Indigenous culture and nationhood and condemning attempts to deny that historical reality. The mission of the Jewish Heritage Center is to document, preserve, and share information on the culture and historical formation of Jewish communities in Western Canada. The center also serves as an advocate for anti-racism and as a purveyor of education on the Holocaust and anti-Semitism. Our vision is to forge a pathway for the future by preserving and sharing compelling stories and educating the present and future generations. It is now my pleasure to pass the virtual microphone over to Dan Stone, the past president of the Jewish Heritage Center and the chair of our Programs and Exhibits Committee.
Thank you, Belle. It's a pleasure for me to introduce the substantive part of today's program. I had the pleasure of meeting Wayne Hoffman, the author whose book we're doing the Winnipeg launch of, at a meeting to prepare this program some weeks ago, and found him a very lively and very interesting man, as good as his book, or possibly better, as you can see why it's such an interesting book. As you know from the title, there are two elements to this book. We'll be stressing the element of Winnipeg history, but if we only touch on it lightly, and please think also about reading the rest of it, which deals with the family problems with Alzheimer's. As someone whose family has brushed against Alzheimer's, I very much appreciated the sensitivity and the accuracy of what he wrote. So I found this book quite fascinating and very much look forward to hearing what he says today and his conversation with Allan Levine, a well-known historian about whom I'll say later. The format of the program is, after I manage to stop speaking, that Wayne will talk and show some of his pictures. After that, he will have a conversation with Allan, who is uniquely qualified to deal with this. As Belle said, there is a question and answer period at the end of this. Please type your questions in the Q&A. I will monitor it, keep an eye on it. At the end of it, I'll pose questions to
I see we seem to have lost Dan. So Allan and Wayne, please continue.
Hello, everybody. Thank you for having me, Jewish Heritage Center of Western Canada. And Allan, it's a pleasure to see you. Thank you in particular to Dan and Belle and Stan and Andrew and Mark and everyone at the Jewish Heritage Center of Western Canada, not only for having me today, but also for helping me make this book possible. And that goes for Allan Levine as well. Without all of you, it's no exaggeration to say I wouldn't have a book to be presenting today. So I wanted to start by telling you how this book came to be.
I had a computer issue. Have I come back in? Should I pick up? Have you gone on without me, or shall I pick up? Anyway, there'll be a Q&A period.
Without you, Dan.
Pardon?
We've gone on without you.
Okay. Where are we now?
Shall I
Go
go?
ahead, Wayne. Go ahead.
Okay. I believe you can see this photo now, if I'm doing this right.
Yes.
It all started with a photograph. When my mother, Susan, was growing up in Jersey City, New Jersey in the 1940s, she found a photograph in her parents' desk drawer when she was 7 or 8 years old. The photograph was a picture of her Zeta David, the man seated, her grandfather David, with a strange woman. She asked her mother, "Who's this with Zeta David?" And her mother said, "That's my mother." My mother had been to Winnipeg and met her Zeta David and her Baba Bela, her grandmother, and this was not her. So she asked her mother, "Who is this really? This is not your mother. I've met your mother." And this is the story her mother told her. She said, "When I was growing up in Winnipeg as a little girl, my mother was breastfeeding my baby sister outside on the front porch in winter when a drive-by sniper drove by and shot her dead, leaving the baby at her breast unharmed." My mother heard this story and thought, sure, that makes sense. She grew up hearing the story many times and believing it. When I grew up in Maryland, just outside Washington, D.C. in the 70s, I heard this story many times from my mother. I never believed it. I never said anything. It just didn't seem plausible. But I kept my mouth shut. My mother, after all, was a very good storyteller, and this was a good story. Fast forward to 2010. My mother, Susan, has been diagnosed with dementia, what we would later realize was Alzheimer's disease. One of the first things I did was take a video camera home to get her telling family stories on video before she forgot them. She was really the keeper of family histories, and once she forgot them, they'd be lost to time. We got to the story that I've heard 100 times about the drive-by shooting in Winnipeg. Only this time I called her on it. And I said, "This story's not true. It can't be true. It never happened." She said, "Why isn't it true?" I said, "It doesn't make any sense. Nobody was breastfeeding outside on a front porch in Winnipeg in winter, period. Nobody. And second of all, this is 100 years ago. How many drive-by snipers were there? Were they driving Model Ts? Were they shooting muskets? Why were they targeting nursing mothers on their front porches? It doesn't make any sense." And my mother said to me, "Okay, if that's not what happened, then what did happen?" I've been a journalist for more than 30 years. And I thought, how long could it possibly take to find out? Give me a couple weeks. It took years. It took years of digging. The breakthrough came after I'd had trouble finding any information about my relatives with their names spelled the way I thought they were spelled. I changed the spelling and hit pay dirt. I came across a woman named Sarah Feinstein, even though our family had spelled it with an A, Feinstein. But Sarah Feinstein had a death certificate on record with the Manitoba Vital Statistics from 1913, which was when my grandmother would have been about 4, and her baby sister would still have been breastfeeding. So I sent away for the death certificate. And when it came in the mail, it revealed a very surprising fact. The cause of death was listed as bullet wound through brain, homicidal. I started to wonder, what if the story my mother told was right? What if the story her mother told her was right? It seemed so improbable and so implausible that there'd be a drive-by sniper shooting nursing mothers, but maybe it was true. But then it struck me, if a woman, a young mother was shot, was murdered, it probably would have been in the newspaper. So I started digging in newspapers. The Winnipeg Free Press, which still exists today, is also one of the oldest papers around in Winnipeg, and they had existed when this murder took place. So that's the first place I looked. And I found some stories, and then I found more stories. And then I found some more documents and birth certificates and death certificates and marriage certificates and birth certificates and census reports and business directories. And then with the help of the Jewish Heritage Center of Western Canada, gravestones, Yiddish newspapers, old records. And I started piecing things together. What I found out was, on the one hand, a very specific story about what happened to my great-grandmother, Sarah Feinstein, and how she was killed. But more broadly, it was a story about her whole life and my family's whole life. But much more broadly than that, it was a story in the context about Jewish immigration to Canada, in particular Western Canada, in the early part of the 20th century. The family, as it turns out, had not only settled in Winnipeg, they had also, for quite a period of time, worked and even lived in rural Saskatchewan. And then eventually, largely uprooted and moved to Vancouver. So by following the family's history, I could follow a lot of the history of Jews across Western Canada. That's the basis for what turned into the book. Of course, while I was doing all this research, trying to answer questions for my mother continued to decline due to Alzheimer's disease. Those two stories put together are what make up my new book, The End of Her, Racing Against Alzheimer's to Solve a Murder. So I wanted to read you an excerpt from the book to sort of get things started with what I found out about the story and also the larger community. So here's an excerpt from The End of Her. My great-grandmother Sarah was born in May 1887, the oldest of 4 children. As a teenager, Sarah was pursued by a young man from a wealthy and powerful family in her hometown, the Ukrainian village of Dubrovina. She rebuffed him. Furious, he swore revenge, even if it takes me a lifetime, he said. Perhaps fearing what her spurned suitor might do, or perhaps more broadly concerned about a wave of pogroms starting in 1903 and lasting 3 years, taking thousands of Jewish lives across Russia and driving a massive wave of Jewish emigration, Sarah left for North America in 1906. Within a few months of her arrival in Winnipeg, Sarah married David Feinstein on October 27th, 1906. Born in Chudinov, a mostly Jewish shtetl of several thousand on the Teperovka River, 30 miles southwest of the Ukrainian city of Zhytomyr, David had come to Canada 2 years earlier in 1904 and became a naturalized Canadian citizen in 1906. He went into business with his 4 brothers and became a cattle dealer. As newlyweds, David and Sarah lived at 633 Manitoba Avenue in Winnipeg's North End. Jews had been living in the North End since the early 1880s, when Russian refugees fleeing an earlier wave of pogroms that arose in the wake of the 1881 assassination of Tsar Alexander II were first welcomed to Canada in modest numbers, lured by the promise of free land, to set up what Prime Minister John A. Macdonald had called a Jew colony. A few hundred had then settled in Winnipeg, which prior to the arrival of this wave of Russian immigrants had just 100 Jews, mostly of English and German heritage, scattered across various parts of the city. 10,000 Russian Jews would eventually settle in Manitoba, nearly all of them in Winnipeg. Newcomers initially lived in immigrant sheds, crowded wooden barracks housing hundreds of people along the Red River in the part of town known as the Forks, or in shanties in the flats nearby. Nearly all the Russian Jews eventually settled in Winnipeg's North End, giving it the nickname New Jerusalem, or, to those less fond of the newcomers, Jewtown. When David and Sarah were married in 1906, the North End was a rundown, working-class immigrant neighborhood. Most of Winnipeg's Jews, 4,000 by that point, lived there, the majority having arrived in the past 5 years. They lived alongside other Eastern European immigrants, Serbians, Croatians, Ukrainians, and ethnic Poles from Galicia, then an autonomous region of Austria-Hungary. in tiny houses built close together along black, muddy roads lined with wooden sidewalks. Some houses had electricity, but others did not. Those who couldn't afford the city's steep sewer fees had to make do with privies in their backyards next to their chicken coops. They bathed in basins in their kitchens. Drinking water was filthy. An epidemic of typhoid called Red River fever swept the neighborhood in 1905. And crime, including anti-Semitic violence, was rampant. The streets closest to the rail yards were the poorest and the roughest. Moving further north, away from the train tracks, was an indication of success. David and Sarah's house on Manitoba Avenue, 6 blocks north of the tracks, quickly got crowded. David's teenage brother, Louis, his youngest sibling, immigrated from Russia in 1907 and moved in with them. That same year, David and Sarah had their first child, Harry. They moved to 475 Flora Avenue, 3 blocks south, closer to the train tracks, a move in the wrong direction. While the family was living on Flora Avenue, my grandmother Ethel was born in 1909. Fanny, her sister, followed in 1911. This is the census report from 1911, before Fanny was born. You can see their brother, that my great-grandfather's brother, Louis, was living with them at the time. After a few years in Winnipeg, the Feinstein's cattle business was going well. Things were looking far better for the family financially. In 1912, around the same time their 4th child, Anne, was born in the fall, David and Sarah moved to a bigger house at 520 Magnus Avenue. Although it was still crowded and unpaved, Magnus was 4 blocks north of Flora Avenue, 4 blocks further away from the railroad tracks, 4 steps up the economic ladder. The family was doing well by this point financially. Sarah could enjoy some of the finer things in life, like jewelry and furs. The future must have seemed full of promise, but it wouldn't last. Nobody in the house heard the intruder fire a gun at Sarah Feinstein's right temple as she slept in the early hours of Friday, August 1st, 1913. Even 2-year-old Fanny, curled up at her mother's breast, continued to sleep as the blood seeped into the sheets and soaked her nightgown. It was Anne, the infant in the crib next to Sarah's bed, who made the first noise shortly after 2:45 in the morning. She started crying, perhaps because she'd witnessed a stranger in the house or sensed that someone had hurt her mother, although there had been no confrontation, no struggle, or possibly just because she was hungry and wanted to be fed. It wasn't unusual for Anne to wake up crying in the middle of the night, but it was rare for her crying to continue without Sarah tending to her needs. Harry, the oldest child, 2 weeks shy of his 6th birthday, sensed that Anne's continued crying was an indication that something was wrong. He got up from the room where he was sleeping alongside his little sister Ethel, my grandmother, and the family's current hired girl, a Ukrainian immigrant named Victoria Komanovska, and walked into his mother's bedroom in the rear of the house to wake her up. When he couldn't, he told Victoria, who tried to rouse Sarah without success. The small red light that Sarah typically left on during the night had been extinguished, so she turned it on, and then she saw the blood. Frightened and unsure what to do without Sarah's husband David at home, Victoria shouted to the Feinstein's neighbor, Lucy Kessler, through the window, "I've been calling my mistress and she won't wake up." Then Victoria ran out the front door, which was closed but unlocked, something she noticed because she had locked the doors before going to bed, and Sarah had checked them as well. Victoria woke the Kasners next door at 516 Magnus Avenue. "I can't wake the missus," she told them through her tears. Lucy arrived first and accompanied Victoria to the back bedroom. Robert Kasner came in next with a young man named Abram Shurman. Robert saw the bullet hole in Sarah's right temple, and Abram shouted at Victoria, "You're crazy, the woman is shot." Abram ran back next door to call the police. The Feinstein house, like most in Winnipeg's North End, didn't yet have a telephone. He then called 2 local doctors, Dr. George Hirsch Kalichman and Dr. Abram Berkovich. Kalichman arrived first on the scene just after 3 o'clock in the morning. He pronounced Sarah dead. Her body was still warm, indicating to him that she'd been shot within the previous half hour. Eventually, 2 police officers showed up, from North Winnipeg Station. The house was cordoned off, pending a full coroner's jury that was called for 5 o'clock that afternoon. Other than police, there were now more than 20 officers on the scene. The only person allowed inside the Feinstein's house was a representative of the local Chevra Kadisha, the Jewish Burial Society, which would ensure that someone would sit with the body until burial in accordance with Jewish law. After several unsuccessful efforts to reach David by telephone, he was away on business in Kinora, Saskatchewan, where he bought cattle. Abram ultimately contacted him by telegraph shortly after noon. Informed of his wife's death, David set out for Winnipeg by train as quickly as he could, but there was only one direct train on that route each day, leaving at 4:55 in the afternoon. David wouldn't make it back until the following morning. So his brother Harry's wife, Pauline, took in David and Sarah's children at her house down the block on Magnus Avenue. Temperatures climbed into the 80s that afternoon, and people gathered in the heat outside 520 Magnus Avenue, talking in Yiddish about what had happened and who might be responsible. Most of the fingers, including that of Abram Shorman, who said he lived next door, pointed at a woman named Mary Manastaka and her boyfriend, Stefan Kashowski. The previous Friday, the neighbor said, Sarah had dismissed Mary, a Galician girl she'd recently hired. Sarah reportedly didn't approve of Mary's relationship with Stefan, a 24-year-old brakeman for the railroad who lived in a boarding house a block away on Selkirk Avenue. After she was fired, the story went, Mary tried to convince 17-year-old Victoria, who'd worked for Sarah since she arrived in Canada less than 4 months earlier, to follow her out the door. When Victoria was scrubbing the veranda, Mary stopped on the sidewalk to admonish her. "Why do you work for Jews?" she asked. When she couldn't goad Victoria into responding, she stepped up onto the veranda to continue her tirade. "The Jews were cast out of Russia," Mary told her, using expletives, "and so they should be in Canada." Sarah came out of the house at this point and shoved Mary off the veranda. According to neighbors who claimed to have witnessed the exchange, Mary left vowing revenge. As news of the murder spread to the North End, a crowd gathered outside the Feinstein's house. There were never fewer than 300 people on the street that day, barred from entering by a local constable who blocked the doorway. Journalists from Winnipeg's rival daily newspapers, the Manitoba Free Press and Winnipeg Telegram, both of which came out in the mornings, and the afternoon Winnipeg Tribune, spoke with the onlookers, digging for information. But like the police, who were talking to neighborhood residents in hopes of finding clues, they were faced with a language barrier, since the locals tended to speak Yiddish or Polish or Ukrainian. By 4 o'clock that afternoon, the Tribune had splashed news of the murder across the top of its front page. "Prominent member of Hebrew colony shot to death as she slept," read the headline, 4 columns wide, above a large photograph identified as their wedding portrait, the same one my mother would find decades later in a drawer. Anti-Semitism was cited as a possible motive. Victoria and Mary were taken to the Central Police Station and held as material witnesses. Stefan had not yet been arrested, but he had been spotted. After allegedly skipping work at the rail yards that day, he had appeared just before 9 o'clock at Feynman's Confectionery at 192 Andrews Street, around the block from the Feinstein's house. He bought a bottle of aerated water and sat on a box to drink it. He casually asked the proprietress, "What's happening on Magnus Avenue that's attracting such a crowd?" "Don't you read the papers?" she asked him. "Mrs. Feinstein was shot at 3 o'clock this morning." Stefan told her he hadn't read about the crime because he couldn't read English. Then he asked if anyone had been arrested. "Oh, yes," said the shopkeeper, who recognized him as a frequent customer. "Mrs. Feinstein's girl, and the one that used to come here with you." Stefan knew she meant Mary, whom Stefan had brought in more than once to buy a pop. His lips started to quiver. He dropped the bottle on the floor where it smashed into shards and fled through the doorway. The next day, Saturday, August 2nd, David's train arrived in Winnipeg at 7:20 in the morning. The story of his wife's murder appeared in all 3 daily newspapers' Saturday editions. Journalists tried to interview David, but as the Tribune explained, he appears to have suffered terribly since the news was broken to him, and he's altogether under too much stress of grief to speak very much to reporters. Coroner Ritchie followed his medical certificate of death that Saturday. The cause of death was listed as a bullet wound through brain, homicidal, the same document I'd receive a century later. On the same day, synagogues across Winnipeg were reading that week's Torah portion, Maseh, the final section from the book of Numbers. Preparing the children of Israel to enter the promised land, God tells Moses in Maseh to instruct his people to set up cities of refuge when they enter Canaan. But anyone who intentionally kills another person with a stone or a wooden tool or an iron object will not be allowed sanctuary there. That person is a murderer, the Torah makes plain. That person must be put to death. The murder made headlines across Canada, from Montreal to Toronto to Vancouver, in the English newspapers and the Yiddish press. In Winnipeg, the three English dailies would run dozens of stories about the murder, and the Yiddish press, at the time a weekly called Der Canada Yid, the Canadian Jew, would also report on the tragedy at 520 Magnus Avenue. This is a picture of Magnus Avenue a few years after the incident, so this is largely what it looked like at the time. 3,000 people gathered to pay respects on the morning of Sunday, August 3rd, 1913, in front of the family's home at 520 Magnus Avenue. The house, which had been cordoned off by police since Sarah was brutally murdered early Friday morning, was open to visitors for the day. The crowd was extraordinary for the city, which had roughly 150,000 residents at the time. Winnipeg had never seen such a big funeral, the Canada Yid reported. The Tribune noted it was, quote, attended by practically the entire Hebrew colony of the city. When the crowd grew too large and unruly, police had to call in extra squad to control it. A brief service was held in the house, after which the casket was brought outside to a waiting carriage. The coffin was brought to Tiferes Israel, a synagogue that had opened that year around the block from the Feinstein's home at Manitoba Avenue and Power Street, the same street corner where David and Sarah had been married 7 years before. The service began at 11 in the morning, conducted by Rabbi Israel Isaac Kahanovich, the city's chief rabbi and leader of the Beth Jacob Synagogue on Schultz Street, the largest synagogue in the North End. His rival, Rabbi Jacob Gorodsky, a community rabbi for several new synagogues in the North End in the 19-teens, had been dubbed the second chief rabbi in the Yiddish newspaper. Gorodsky, too, spoke at Sarah Feinstein's funeral, a sign of unity in the city's sometimes divided Jewish community. It was 76 degrees and fair, a beautiful summer day, as the funeral procession began. The route spanned more than 5 miles to the Children of Israel Cemetery on Almy Avenue, across the Red River in Transcona, a town that had been incorporated only 2 years earlier and didn't even have a proper sewer system yet, serving mainly as a home to repair yards for the railroads. Several hundred people made this journey to the gravesite on foot or in horse-drawn carriages. By the time they arrived, it was mid-afternoon. Winnipeg's first Jewish graveyard, Children of Israel, had opened 30 years before in March 1883, the land purchased for $800. The first people buried there were 5 infants who had died the previous winter. They had originally been buried temporarily in a flood-prone cemetery on Thomas Street in what was then the city's red light district, before being moved to the new site. By the time of Sarah's funeral, there were just a few dozen graves of Children of Israel. David had gotten through much of the day without breaking down. But when his wife's body was taken out of the hearse, David threw himself on her casket. It is impossible, Der Kennedy had reported, to describe the harrowing effect this tragedy had on him. As the casket was interred, David lost all control, throwing himself on the ground and screaming in anguish until the rabbis calmed him down and escorted him home. Or rather, since his home at 520 Magnus Avenue was again behind a police cordon as a crime scene, he was taken back to his brother Harry's house down the block, where his children had been staying with their Aunt Pauline since the murder. They would all remain there for the next week, sitting Shiva in observance of Jewish mourning rituals. That's a taste of the book.
Thank you, Bill. Am I on? Yeah, thank you very much, Wayne. Thank you very much for that riveting description of the tragic situation. And let me just add, as someone who had a chance to see the book, that it continues on many aspects beyond that. So I highly recommend it. I had the pleasure of seeing a pre-publication copy, and I heartily recommend it. Now, for a more qualified discussion, let me turn to Allan Levine, who is as uniquely qualified, I think, as the author of 5 mystery stories and 11 non-fictional historical accounts, mostly dealing with Canadian Jewish history, at least a lot of them, and especially the award-winning Coming of Age, A History of the Jewish People of Manitoba, which Allan wrote in conjunction with the Jewish Heritage Center of Western Canada, and which, as you may know, won the McNally Robinson Book of the Year Award. In it, Allan has a doctorate in history from the University of Toronto, and incidentally, an honorary doctorate from the University of Winnipeg, Doctor of Laws, for his contributions to historical accounts in Canada. Some of his books include Details Are Unprintable, Wayne Lonergan and the Sensational Cafe Society Murder, Seeking the Fabled City, about Toronto, The Canadian Jewish Experience, which was longlisted for the RBC Taylor Prize. William Lyon Mackenzie King, A Life Guided by the Hand of Destiny, which won the Alexander Kennedy Isbister Award for nonfiction. In addition, if this weren't enough, Allan has been writing columns now and then for the Winnipeg Free Press for a dozen years, and also contributes articles and reviews to the Globe and Mail, the National Post, the Toronto Star, Maclean's, Canada History, and Wayne's publication Tablet. So with this, I will please turn this over to Allan to talk about the book and the events with Wayne.
Thanks, Dan. You can hear me okay, Wayne?
Yes.
Anyways, that was very interesting, fascinating. As you know, you and I have talked about this before, because when we first met in Winnipeg, I was always stunned, really, and somewhat almost embarrassed that after decades of digging into the history of the North End and Jewish history in particular, I had not heard of this story, which shocked me given all the research you've done and the newspaper accounts. It actually quite amazes me, and I've been thinking about it in preparation for this, and it's not only that I missed it, it was never, as far as I can figure out or have seen, it was never actually mentioned anywhere in the Jewish Historical Society, which the predecessor of the Jewish Heritage Center. And I mean, over the years, there have been dozens and dozens of stories and other books besides Coming of Age, and not once. I mean, when I wrote Coming of Age, I did come across a few stories of which Jews were involved in crime. One in which a Jewish guy had coerced a young Jewish woman from Russia into prostitution, and he was eventually put on trial. So I had included that story. But I only found that story because it had been included in a book by J.S. Woodsworth, who was a Winnipeg Reformer, later politician. He wrote a book in 1909 and 1911, 2 books, and he included it in one of them. That's what triggered me. I mean, even when I was writing about Jewish history in Canada, I mean, I wrote about Jewish gangsters in Montreal, which is fascinating, but there's not a ton about it. But this story, it should have been noted somewhere, and it really is. I don't know. What do you think? I mean, maybe it's just that the community itself, which was always very careful about how they presented themselves, didn't want to delve into a murder story like this, but it's still rather amazing to me.
it's possible that it may have been about people deliberately not wanting to delve into it. It also probably doesn't help that on a smaller scale, on a familial level, it wasn't discussed. It wasn't discussed within the family. Right. And I think that was for more personal reasons. There were small children involved. My grandmother was 3 when this happened, and she had 2 younger sisters. And my great-grandfather would go on to remarry and have more children with his second wife. So I think it was seen as, on the one hand, something the family didn't want to talk about because we don't talk about the first wife in front of the second wife. Right. But also, the children didn't grow up orphaned or poor. They grew up in perfectly fine financial situation with a loving mother who was technically their stepmother, but they called her mom or their mother. So it really wasn't discussed. It wasn't rehashed, and then it wasn't passed down. So it may have been also people following their lead that this is something that's just going to be hushed up. And this is in an age before, certainly not before gossip, but before sort of systematic gossip in terms of the press and later the social media would make public even things you didn't want to be public. At this point, when they weren't talking about it, I think other people weren't talking about it either. Right.
No, that makes sense. It's still very fascinating. I having gone through the Free Press headlines, I like to give myself a shake sometimes. Is how I miss those stories.
I was stunned to see how widely known the story was at the time. But right. Part of the problem, this is particularly a problem with women going back a century, is that their names change once they get married. So you have a bunch of things happening. You had, my great-grandmother was born Shifra Alverbruch in Russia or Ukraine. She comes to North America and she's still Shifra, but now Averbruch turns into Brooks. It's unclear whether that was her idea or a census taker's idea. Who said, I don't know what the hell you just said, let's just call you Brooks. And it didn't really matter because as soon as she was married, she went by her husband's name. And her English name was Sarah, but she never really used it. And the newspaper reports don't even use her first name. They call her Mrs. David Feinstein. And that name later changed to Feinstein. So when I'm searching for Shifra Averbruch, and there's a headline about Sarah Feinstein, you have to know a lot of steps along the way to realize that's the same person. That the person in the headline is my great-grandmother. There's no way you know that unless you knew every step of that process. Yeah. It's very difficult to find information.
Yeah. I was going to say just one more comment about this is that there was a famous murder involving the Bronfman family in the early 1920s. Now, maybe because of their stature later, that story became more well known. It dealt with a murder in Saskatchewan, actually, over probably booze and money, but it was more well known and has been referenced. That's always been more known. But what about tracking this story? I know you said it was very difficult. How did the Jewish Heritage Center archives help you research, and what about the limitations of all the official documents that you had to deal with?
So every source of information has limitations. The newspaper reports are often contradictory and incomplete or fueled by gossip that turns out not to be true. So if you follow one newspaper story, you have to follow all of them to find out the things they told you yesterday turned out not to be true the next day. So those have problems. Official documents were told not directly. You didn't fill out a census report. You had a census taker who spoke English come, and you told him things probably in Yiddish or in broken English, which they then translated and wrote down, except there's no consistency. English names for my grandmother and her siblings changed from form to form because they didn't use their English names. So they change all the time. And which year were they born? I don't remember. Who's older? I don't know. And you find a quote unquote official information that's not possible. We had 2 siblings who were allegedly born 2 weeks apart. That can't be true. Something's wrong here. The Jewish Heritage Center, early on, I found the Free Press archives because those are online through the Free Press, which still exists. So that was the first place I could find. The Heritage Center helped me a lot with digging into Yiddish press, which I can understand some Yiddish, but I'm very, very far from fluent in it, not even remotely fluent. So I really needed help looking through those archives. but also looking through old records and business directories and finding very curious information, some of which I still can't make heads or tails of, sometimes incidental small things that happen along the way. And one of the most important things was helping find people in cemeteries, which was a larger project done by folks, I believe, outside the Heritage Center, but the photographs of the gravestones themselves were kept in the Heritage Center and were also cataloged there. And I'd gone there on my first trip to Winnipeg, looking for information not only about my great-grandmother, but also about other members of the family that I had questions about. And they were very helpful in helping me put together some of those pieces. Again, some of those pieces turned out later to be actually not the right road. I had to go back and refigure it out. But again, going back to the Heritage Center meant I could find out which path was finally the right one. Looking at things from 1913 and earlier, it's very difficult to find a lot of paperwork. So every bit of information, every single mention in a newspaper of the family, or every document about a business directory or a voter roll, a census report, all of it is really essential to putting together a story. It's very hard to construct otherwise without everything. Just the newspapers wouldn't have been enough.
Right, right. What about, I mean, I sort of know the answer to this question because I myself have, having also constructed a murder mystery, it was important to actually be and see the places that are involved. But what about the physical location? Did you feel like you got a better sense of the story? You've been to Winnipeg a few times. I
did. So my grandmother grew up in Winnipeg, but she also moved to the States when she was 19 years old. And she lived in Jersey City the rest of her life, or most of the rest of her life. And also never had a lot of money. So she didn't run back to Winnipeg to visit family very often. And then in the 40s, her father and her stepmother and her siblings moved to Vancouver. So there really wasn't much connection left to Winnipeg at all. So I'd never been there. I hadn't had close relatives there since the 40s. I was born in 1970. But once I started doing this research, I realized I have no sense of it. I don't have a sense of where things are, what things look like, what it means to say the houses on this street were small. What does that mean? I don't know. Or how close together were they? So I went to Winnipeg for the first time in 2013, looking for places, looking to get a sense of the North End, looking to get a sense of the cemeteries, to get a sense of how wide this street was, how close these blocks were together, where the rail yards were, to really see. And obviously much of it's not there anymore, much of it's changed, and it's certainly grown by leaps and bounds, and a lot of the Jewish community has moved. But still, going to see the physical places was very important. The most unfortunate part was I really wanted to see 520 Magnus Avenue, but that block was torn down probably 50 years ago or more. The whole block is gone. It's now part of a school, which takes up the entire block, the school and its grounds. So it's gone. I can't see the house. It no longer exists. And the houses on the other side of the street, I thought, well, maybe the houses across the street, which are still there, maybe those were sort of mirror images of what used to be on this side of the street. But I talked to a woman who was sitting on her porch, and her house was, I think, 10 years old. So clearly it was not the house from a century ago. Those houses are all gone.
Right, right. What was your impression of the way the police handled it? I mean, was there pervasive anti-Semitism? Some people believe that. What do you think?
It's hard to ascribe motive. Police and journalists, I'll put in the same basket. I'm sure there was anti-Semitic feeling. It's sort of indisputable when it comes to journalists if you just read their reporting. The way they write about not only Jews, but non-Jewish immigrants as well. I'll give you an example. When they talk about the neighbors in the neighborhood who they're trying to ask questions, they talk about how it's so hard to make heads or tails of anything they say because those people are prone to being excitable and gossipy. And I'm sure they were excitable. Someone they knew had just been murdered in her bed. But they sort of wrote them off as you can't really pay attention to what those people say because those people just talk and talk and talk and talk and talk. And on the flip side, the first person they had arrested or had suspicion of for committing the murder, this Stefan Kashowski, many of the newspapers thought he's the one right off the bat. And one, I think it was the Telegram, said, we don't think it's him. We're the only ones who don't think it's him. Well, why not? Well, because this was really a cunning crime, and he's Galician, he's Polish, and those people are too stupid to commit such a complicated crime. So they were giving him the benefit of the doubt, but only because they really were prejudiced against him. So there was a lot of that. I think the bigger problem beyond sort of conscious prejudice was the language barrier. There's no way around it. The police and the journalists just didn't have enough people who understood the languages, not just Yiddish, but the languages of the North End at the time.
Right.
And when you wind up having things pass through, first of all, the game of telephone that is a crowd on the street, passing along information mixed with gossip that they misheard, or they got a name wrong, or they said the wrong thing. Combine that with the language barrier, and it's very hard to get information. And I don't know, could the police have tried harder? They certainly could have, but they also did go, the city of Winnipeg did do a lot to try to bring justice to this case. They did offer a municipal reward for the first time for information, and then they doubled it, and then they doubled it again. This was unprecedented at the time, so I can't blame them too much, but it is true that they certainly had their biases with the people they were dealing with, both the Jews and the non-Jewish immigrants in the North End alike.
Right. You feel, just, I won't give this away, but do you feel that you solved the crime?
I think so. I can't be certain. I'm not issuing arrest warrants, but I think so. And it didn't strike me the first time I went through this information. I went through this information for years. It actually only struck me later, going through it after I put it aside and I looked at it anew and said, oh, wait a minute. There are a couple clues here that all point in the same direction.
Right.
And it all makes sense. Am I sure that I have it exactly right? No, but I'm pretty sure I have it pretty much right.
Right.
And yes, there are alternative theories. And I know there's probably people on this call who are going, I have an alternative theory. I know I've entertained some of them. And I fully concede that those alternative theories may end up being true. But the things I've seen point to a particular theory of the crime that I think fits.
Okay. You also discovered that Saskatchewan played a large role in your family's history. What can you tell us about that?
It did, and the fact that it played any role in my family's history was news to me. I knew that my grandmother grew up in Winnipeg. I knew we had that connection, and I knew that her parents had later moved to Vancouver. I knew I had that connection. I didn't know anything about Saskatchewan playing a part in my family's history, and apparently it played quite a large one. So when my great-grandfather became a cattle dealer, he went into business with his 4 brothers, or 5 brothers running a business together. At any given time, one of them would have a house in Kinora, Saskatchewan, which is a newly founded hamlet on the Canadian Northern Railroad in the early 1900s. Almost entirely, almost exclusively settled by immigrants because they were giving away free land. The railroad wanted to build a town, and people who wanted free land in the middle of nothing at that point were immigrants who said, great, I'll take free land. So you have a surprising number of Jews, but also Germans, Russians, all sorts of immigrants move to Saskatchewan. And that's where my great-grandfather is doing business. That's where he is on business when his wife is murdered and he has to come home. So that's the first thing I found out, was that that's where he had been working, and that's where he would go on business to buy cattle. What I really didn't know is that when he remarried a couple of years after the murder and went on to have more children, it was his turn. His brother had lived in Saskatchewan for a few years. Now it was my great-grandfather's turn. And he moved the whole family full-time out of Winnipeg to live in Kinora, Saskatchewan. And they lived there for 7 years, which is to say my grandmother spent literally half her childhood in Saskatchewan. She never mentioned this to a soul. My mother never knew, my aunt never knew, no one knew that she had any connection to Saskatchewan. In fact, she spent half her childhood there, from the time she was about 7 until she was 14.
Right.
The place she always said was the place she grew up, that she was born, was the place they moved back to when she was a teenager on Mountain Avenue in the North End, where she actually only lived for a few years before she immigrated to the States. The place she'd lived longer in Saskatchewan was completely removed from her story. So finding that connection was a complete shock. I had not a clue, and neither did my mother.
Right. Okay. You know what? I think I'm going to stop for a minute here. And maybe, Dan, you want to do some questions from people who are watching, perhaps, so we have time to do that?
Yes, thank you, Alan. Thank you, Wayne. There have been a couple of questions, and I'll give them precedence before I pose my own. One question by someone who didn't give a name is, was there ever an explanation how the story came to be that it occurred in the winter outside when you learned that it was in August?
That's one mystery I have absolutely no clue about, which is where on earth did my grandmother come up with this story? What I did learn is that no one else ever heard that story. None of her siblings heard that story. None of my cousins, none of my mother's cousins, no one else had heard that story, any piece of it. So this was something my grandmother either made up at some point, or someone made it up and told her and only her. I don't know why. It's not a story that would make your children feel more at ease. It's a terrifying story of snipers shooting nursing mothers in broad daylight in front of their homes. So I have no clue. No one else has heard this story. I don't know where it came from. She was 3 when this happened, so it's understandable she might not have known all the facts, especially if the family didn't really talk about it when she got older. But where she came to invent things that had never happened and such a bizarre story, I have absolutely no idea. And if only I could go back in time and talk to my grandmother and ask her, that is the very first thing I would ask her.
All of us know that Winnipeg has winter 13 months out of the year. So I guess it makes perfect sense, especially from the distance of Jersey City.
Right.
But a question by Celia Rabinovich, a fine author and researcher herself, is, do you think there was an element of superstition in not discussing or mentioning the murder in addition to protecting the children? And if there was there an aspect of shame or shame in not mentioning it, as if there were a taboo that would have tainted the family? Is this a carryover from traditional Yiddish culture?
There very well may have been. It certainly was something they didn't want to talk about amongst themselves. I don't know if it was because it was a shanda or if it was just that it was a horrible, horrible tragedy. Because both those things are true. One could be that you didn't want to, make the family look bad. The other is that you don't want to talk about it. It's just a horrible event to live through. It's also possible that my great-grandfather, when he remarried, the woman he remarried was also a widow. She had also had a husband die young. He died of natural causes. He wasn't shot by a sniper or by anyone. But you had a sort of a tragic beginning. By the time they get married, the children are still quite young. They're all little kids. And then they have 3 more children together. It's possible that they had just made a decision that I won't talk about my horrible past. You don't talk about your horrible past. We're just going to move on. I don't know if that was superstition or just personal pain, which seems horrible.
Celia also asks whether you have any other pictures of your great-grandmother with family before immigration or after, and do you?
In fact, there is only one picture of my great-grandmother that exists. That is the only one. That photo, the one that my mother found in a drawer, is the only photo that we have of Sarah. That is the photo that wound up in every newspaper report. And when I thought I had found a second photo, when a second cousin of mine outside San Francisco had found from her grandmother, who was the baby Anne, she had the memorial card that was distributed at the funeral. And I said, wow, it's another photograph. Let me see that. And she sent it to me. It's the same photo. It's just a cropped version of the wedding photo. That's the only photo of Sarah that exists. I wish I could find another, but there isn't one. It's possible there was one from before she immigrated, but who knows what happened to it or who might have had it. Really, even the family she left behind had another similar tragedy where her mother had died young and her father had remarried. So she had a lot of half siblings who would later immigrate to Canada as well, but she was already dead by that point, so she never knew them. So they may have had those in their family records somewhere, but it was a picture of someone they never knew. And by the time they might have met her, she was gone. So who would they have given them to? Where would they be now? It's sort of a bunch of broken links.
There's some questions coming in, but I'll take this one more from Celia's question, whether you're in touch with Winnipeg relatives, or are there any Winnipeg relatives?
There are, and actually here's more people who have helped me along the way. I had sent a note to Bernie Bellin, who edits and publishes the Jewish Post News in Winnipeg, because I was going back to Winnipeg. I had found some first cousins, some of my mother's first cousins, who were people I didn't necessarily know, but I knew they existed. But none of them were in Winnipeg. And I thought, maybe I have more distant cousins who are in Winnipeg. My great-grandfather's family moved to Vancouver in the 40s, but some of his siblings maybe didn't. Maybe they stayed. And even though I thought those relatives might be one step further removed biologically from Sarah Feinstein, the fact that they were, if they still lived in Winnipeg, this news might mean more to them and they might remember more. Like 520 Magnus Avenue might mean something to someone who lived in Winnipeg, whereas it wouldn't to someone who moved to Vancouver or grown up in Jersey City. So I sent a note to Bernie asking him if he could help me find any potential relatives, and he very kindly published a note in the Jewish Post and News to see, like, hello, people of Winnipeg, are any of you related to me? And the answer came back indirectly, yes. It wasn't a relative, it was a friend of the family who saw this note and said, I think my friend Barb, who lives in Los Angeles, might be one of your cousins. And it turns out Barb was one of my cousins. And she said, I know different cousins who live in Winnipeg. I'll connect you to them. And indirectly, I finally got through to some cousins in Winnipeg. And once you find a couple of them, they connect you to more. So it took a while, but yes, thanks to, again, help from people in Winnipeg and Bernie Bellin in particular, I was able to connect. And now I do have cousins in Winnipeg. Hello, Linda, Lisa, Beth. Hello.
Louis Kessler, who's contributed a number of chat pieces and various others, asks whether there was a known Jewish crime element in Winnipeg in the 1910s.
Not that I know.
I bet Allan would know.
I mean, I don't believe it was rampant. I mean, as I said, there was a few cases of some Jewish thugs. This story about this woman being coerced into prostitution. And in fact, I was going to say that you have to use a Yiddish translator in court when the trial. She was very meek and scared of testifying against the person who had coerced her. I mean, there was some probably petty thievery. Some Jewish peddlers were accused of crimes here and there, but they could have been contrived. But there was no Jewish gangsters at that point. And even after, not that I know of, nothing like what happened in Montreal, for example.
Now, it does seem like not necessarily my great-grandfather, but certainly some of his brothers were involved, and maybe
Bootlegging.
With maybe my great-grandfather as well, with bootlegging and other maybe shady business dealings, because a couple of his brothers were arrested on what was then Canada's largest tax evasion case in the 50s. So there certainly was some shadiness going on. It's unclear whether my great-grandfather was part of it or whether he had sort of escaped it by moving to Vancouver, whether he escaped to avoid being part of it or whether it was coincidental. It's all unclear at this point, but it does seem like there were certainly some shady dealings in the family a couple generations ago.
I was going to say that, I mean, most of the Winnipeg, there was a lot of people in the North End made their own liquor and sold it on the side. And in fact, my daughter-in-law's great-grandmother was famous for people would line up for, a few pennies and get a shot after dinner.
Sure.
But that's not really crime.
It did seem like from one of the business directories, actually, that the Heritage Center helped me find, that several of my great uncles were, during Prohibition, involved in a mysterious business called like the Manitoba Vinegar Company, right. Making vinegar in Winnipeg for just a few years, which seems very suspicious.
Yes.
Let me just throw in that several decades ago, the head of the Manitoba Liquor Control Commission, whose wife was a student in one of my wife's classes, told me at a party where I could get the best home brew in Manitoba. So I guess I kept a sharp eye on these things. But moving on, Someone would just want to check whether, double check whether the shooting was outside the house as a drive-by sniper or in the bedroom at close range.
In reality, it was in the bedroom at close range. My great-grandmother was asleep in bed with the 2-year-old in bed next to her and the infant in the crib on the other side of her. And someone came into the house, put a gun to her temple and shot her while she slept. It was point blank range, gun to the head while she slept.
And Leslie Lutsky would like to know whether your family and newfound relatives were supportive of your project.
Oh, yeah, everybody was. I mean, I was very, very pleased. You know, and what would be lovely is to say one person knew all the answers and everything fell into place. That's not how it works. But everyone did know a few things. And more than that, everyone was very willing to open up and share what they did know, whatever those memories were. And many of them didn't pertain to the murder per se, but they pertain to how the family operated both before and after the murder, and before and after my branch of the family relocated to Vancouver, and the people who were still behind in Winnipeg. So yes, people were very, very open and supportive about that. I was delighted. It was difficult at first to find people, but once I started finding people, those cousins would help me find other cousins. So it got progressively easier as we went on.
Bernie Bellin writes in, but I'll preface this by saying that after we had some publicity about your upcoming book, someone wrote in saying that a relative had been murdered, a cattle dealer had been murdered in Saskatchewan in 1928. And there are a number of things that are involved in it. Bernie has, for those of you who don't know, has proposed a theory about this. Says, I'll quote it, Alan, you're an expert on bootlegging, not to say you're involved.
Right.
You probably know my theory that this was tied into bootlegging and that another similar murder several years later lends credence to my theory. But how violent was the bootlegging community around that time?
Well, I mean, it was violent probably a little bit, but not during the period when Wayne's great grandmother was murdered. So I read Bernie's theory too. To be honest, I don't buy it. I don't think it's really connected. And there were problems with people in the 20s, like that Bronfman case in 22, when one of the people close in his family got murdered in a robbery. But there were a few other cases. I don't see the connection, to be honest. I mean, maybe some Jewish cattle dealers were robbed periodically, but I'm not sure that has anything to do with what happened in Winnipeg in 1913.
It certainly would have been a different story if, I mean, at the time of the murder, my great-grandparents had some money, and they had valuables that were sitting right out on the desk in the bedroom, and nothing was taken. So right. It seems clear that in the case of my great-grandmother, it wasn't about a robbery at all, even after the fact, to throw police off. So if it was about sending a message, I'm not sure what the message was or who it was being sent to. I'm definitely not discounting the notion that it's part of it. But I've been racking my brain for years trying to figure out what the message could have been. And I have no idea what the message was to kill my great grandmother. I don't know what that
This was something personal, right?
Yeah, it seems that way.
Yes.
Well, on the subject, I'm going to jump in with a Kinora, Saskatchewan story. I was visiting a friend several decades ago who had whose family came from Kinora. Said that there was a big just outside the city of Kinora. There was going to be a big wedding. I'm not sure, probably before the war, and it's a Ukrainian-Canadian family, and people had been preparing their home brew for a long time. But there was a information that the RCMP was about to raid to collect this stash, so it was buried. Unfortunately, not all of it was buried, and people have been prospecting for decades, looking for the stash. Now, this was several decades ago, and I don't know whether anyone has found it yet. But there's your Kinora for you. One more question here on our line, and there's some more that come in since I looked last. Wayne, did you ever come across the name Chodorkov? I'm not sure how to pronounce it, which was my mother's maiden name. who moved to Vancouver.
Yes, I did come across the name Chodorkov. So the book has been many years in the making, but also, if you know how books get published, I didn't finish writing it yesterday. I finished writing it a few years ago. And in the time between I finished writing it and the time it came out, more cousins have come out of the woodwork. In fact, another one just last week. It keeps happening. It was a large family and it's a couple generations ago, so there are plenty of people. So yes, Chodorkov had not come up in my initial research, but since then, a Chodorkov had contacted me to say, we're related, this is how, and now that is a piece of the family that is mentioned in the book, which the first time through, when I initially wrote the book, I not only didn't know the name, I didn't know those relatives existed. When I was searching for my family's, sort of my family tree, my great-grandfather was one of 8 siblings, 7 of whom lived in Winnipeg, some of whom never left Winnipeg once they immigrated. And so finding them was relatively straightforward. Many of them were still Feinsteins and Feinsteins or had related names. They were still in Winnipeg and I could connect them. My great-grandmother, again, her name was Averbruch, and then it became Brooks, and then she got married, it was Feinstein, and then she was murdered and it was Feinstein. I knew very little about her or whether she had siblings. And it took a long time for me to figure out whether she had siblings and who they were. And in fact, Chodorkov does come into play there. And also with the history in Saskatchewan, finding out how much of the family wound up in Saskatchewan. That's another piece of that puzzle. So yes, I did find out the Chodorkov connection, but only belatedly, only maybe last year.
I see. Alan, Bernie would like to argue with you at some point about Jews and bootlegging.
I'm sure he would.
I think we'll leave that for a column in the Jewish Post or an interview. But I'll add here, Celia Rabinovich, who's given a couple of questions, points out at this point that her grandfather, Samuel Cohn, owned the Kinora Hotel, established in 1911.
Where I stayed.
Which had a very long bar and was an establishment where people met. Perhaps your great-grandfather did business there.
He almost certainly did. And when I went to Kinora a few years ago, again, to sort of get a sense of the place, I stayed in the Kinora Hotel deliberately. Kinora is a small town, but there are hotels and motels on the highway. I could have stayed at, a chain modern hotel, but I said, I want to stay at the Kinora Hotel because that was here when my family lived here 100 years ago. And it's also right across the street from the railroad, from the rail station. And that's one of the buildings that everyone in the family would have seen every time they went back and forth. Every time they walked down Main Street, everyone would have seen the Kinora Hotel. And that's where I stayed 100 years later, was right in that very building.
You know how your family got into the cattle business? There were a lot of Jewish cattle dealers. I was doing some checking recently.
I don't know how they made it into such a business. I know that when they immigrated, my great-grandfather was a bricklayer. And when the family immigrated, a lot of the brothers, the sons, my great-grandfather's brothers, found odd jobs. They either also worked as bricklayers or carpenters, and they found odd jobs to get along, painting. But it was my great-grandfather specifically and one of his brothers who first started buying cattle. And I guess, I don't know if that was just a lark, if it was something they had seen someone else do successfully, but it initially was not going to be a big business. It was just the two of them doing one of their many odd jobs. And I guess that took off. And as it took off, it grew to involve all 5 brothers and also sometimes some of the brothers-in-law. And it became the family business. And it quickly became very successful, very lucrative, because within a few years, they all had houses and nice things for the day. So it really took off. I don't know what their initial instinct was, what drove them to it in the first place, but I do know that once they tried it, it quickly worked.
Yeah, they're a surprising number. Some people connected with the kosher slaughter business, but anyway, it's an interesting sideline in addition to tailoring and all the other jobs that we associate with the Jewish community. And
they did have, at least some of the brothers also later ran an abattoir. So you have sort of that connection. Some of you are dealing cattle and some of you are slaughtering cattle. So they seem to be linked.
Which abattoir was it? Do you know?
Oh, I won't remember the name off the top of my head. I bet some of my cousins in Winnipeg would, though.
Anyway. Well, people have been sending in questions, and we've run through them. A credit to the program and the answers of Allan and Wayne is that we have the same number of people in the audience that we had 20 minutes ago, and a few people came in late, but no one left early.
Right.
So I think at this point I will thank you very much and turn the program over to Belle, who is unmuting and videoing.
Well, thank you very much for all to you, Wayne, Allan, Dan. This was really fascinating and delightful, and I'm sure that so many people are going to want to read the book now. Just a note also to thank all of you out there, our attendees in cyberspace, and just give you a little bit of information about some terrific programs that we have coming up. On March the 1st at 7 p.m., we'll be exploring the complexity and diversity of our community through the film Manishma, featuring the film's directors Joanna Reimer-Hentelef and Sarah Bullock, as well as panelists Andrew Kaplan and Florencia Cates, and moderator Louise Waldman. On March 29th at 7 p.m., Itai Zutra will look at the revival of Yiddish culture in Israel. On April 7th at 10 a.m., we'll be holding a virtual Holocaust and Human Rights Symposium with Warsaw Ghetto survivor Stephen Carter of Winnipeg and Anishinaabe writer and academic Negan Sinclair and moderator Carlisa Posnick Evans. Now, normally this program is limited to schools, but the virtual format will allow us to invite the general public to attend. And the Jewish Heritage Center has been holding the Holocaust and Human Rights Symposium now for 20 years. And then our first person event in more than 2 years is our Saul and Florence Caney lecture on June the 8th at Congregation Sherezetic Synagogue. Our guest speaker will be Jake Tapper, CNN anchor and chief Washington correspondent, and his topic will be the fate of democracy. Tickets are on sale now at Eventbrite.ca. For more information on any of these programs, please go to our website, jhcwc.org, or subscribe to our fabulous newsletter, or write to me at jewishheritage@jhcwc.org. Thank you again, and enjoy the rest of your Sunday, and if you're in Canada, the long weekend. Thanks very much. Bye-bye.
Thank you, Wayne.